and I can't do them any justice in introduction. So I'm going to turn it over to Rags right after I tell you. I'm going to mute everybody other than the speaker so that we don't get distracted from what's happening. So if you see yourself getting muted over and over, I apologize. Just trying to keep so we can keep a smooth running program. Also, we're going to have our general meeting right after Mr. Page does his presentation, as we want to make sure that we get the full effect and don't cut the program short. So the meeting, I hope you guys will stick around, and we'll be having our general meeting right after the presentation by Mr. Page. Rags, I'm going to turn the meeting over to you. Don't forget to hit record, sir.
Okay, I have hit record. And so welcome everybody to our final presentation for our general meeting for the 2020-2021 season. What a season it's been with COVID, right? But the cool thing is that Zoom is allowing us to flex a little bit on how we get some of our content. And just like Andy, I'm super thrilled to have Nick presenting tonight. I've known Nick since 2016. I knew him before virtually by listening to his podcast and listening to his YouTube videos, which have carried me along the photographic journey. So Nick has the wonderful pleasure of being from Walla Walla, Washington, which is in the southeast corner of Washington. And it puts him in close to the Palouse, which is a giant grain belt, similar to what I grew up in Indiana. So, miles and miles of rolling hills with beautiful green vistas that he can shoot. But it also puts him within driving distance of the Oregon coast, the Washington coast, and many of the inland epic photography opportunities that Washington and Oregon offer. And Nick's taken full advantage of that. And then the beauty of it is he's shared it with everybody. And so Nick has an interesting life story, but what he's done is he's reinvented himself to be an educator, and he has a wonderful way of teaching. I think we'll get a little bit of a taste of that tonight. That really is relatable, is given in a way that is comprehensive. He does it. He doesn't just kind of study it and teach something. So you're going to see a true journeyman showing his craft in a way that he wants to help others come up that level on that craft. And so Nick, it's a great pleasure having you tonight. Thank you, my friend.
Well, thank you. I'm going to have you introduce me everywhere I go now. That was pretty awesome. Yeah, so I've been doing photography like only 8 years, something like that. I got my first camera in the, what was it? It was in the fall of 2020, of 2012. Had this back surgery, got my first camera and all that. And then within a year of getting my first camera for the very first time, I became like this do everything photographer where I was shooting weddings and sports and real estate and babies and portraits and a little landscape mixed in. And I was doing everything to the point where I was making more money on my weekends than I was during my weekdays at my day job. And within a year of getting my first camera, I quit the day job and went full time. And through through a process of elimination, I ended up kind of eliminating all of the different types of photography that I enjoyed less than others, which meant that in the end, pretty much all I do is I photograph sports sometimes, but I also photograph lots and lots of landscape photography. So that's pretty much what I do. I nerd out about it. If you've never heard of me, I have a YouTube channel where it's a lot of post-processing kind of stuff, but I also share a lot of in the field kind of adventure films, I guess you would call them. Nowadays they are. I hate the word vlogging because I don't want to be the guy that's just rambling into a camera nonstop and babbling. I want to actually tell the story of being there. So that's a lot of what I do. I teach a lot of workshops, and through teaching workshops, I interact with a lot of people with varying degrees of comfortability. I start making up words. Varying degrees of knowledge in post-processing. I myself am a Photoshop nerd. Not so much because I want to fake a scene, more so because I love the power that Photoshop has available to us as photographers. Lightroom is great for a lot of um, quick and dirty edits, but Photoshop is so much more precise and it has so much more control. I really push everybody towards Photoshop. So one of the most intimidating terms that gets thrown around when you're talking about post-processing in Photoshop is the term luminosity mask. And so that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit, because I am a huge nerd when it comes to luminosity masks because of just the level of control that it can give you. So it would be interesting, like in the chat, to go ahead and maybe talk a little bit about your own, like, you know, where are you at with Photoshop? But what's your level of comfort? Are, you know, it's always interesting to kind of feel out the room to see if I'm, you know, talking over everybody's heads or just talking about stuff that you already know. So maybe in the chat, let me know where you are at with your post processing. So luminosity masks. Luminosity masks are essentially just an extension of two things. All a luminosity mask is a black and white version of your photo used as either a layer mask or a selection. So I think it's easiest if I just show you. So I'm going to start sharing my screen here. You guys let me know if it's working. Let me go over to Photoshop. Can you guys see my screen? All right. I guess I can't listen for you since you're all muted. Okay, so let me move this out of the way here. So if I was to, I got a lot of paraphernalia, Zoom paraphernalia all over my screen. So if I had an image and I wanted to create a luminosity mask of my image, I could do so by going to my channels tab here, and I could control click, hold down control or command and click on the RGB channel. And you can see that it's brought up some marching ants. Marching ants always let you know when you have an active selection. I could, let me maximize here. I could then save that selection by clicking the save current selection as channel button. I struggle with that because I never use it. And then if I go down to this alpha 1 that I created here, basically you can see it's nothing more than a black and white version of our photo. And the moral of the story is all a luminosity mask is a black and white version of our photo that we're going to either use as a layer mask or as a layer mask or a selection. So for argument's sake, let's go back here. Hold on a second. Got to get rid of my, I hate that. Once you get this stupid, there we go. Okay. So let's say that I wanted to add contrast to this photo, because obviously this is an incredibly flat scene that we're looking at. We were looking through a whole bunch of sea spray and mist at this moment. So my camera is seeing things in a very, very flat way, more so than my eyes were. So let's say I just wanted to create a levels contrast adjustment here. So we have a levels contrast adjustment. We'll add some contrast through it. And the problem that you run into when you start applying global contrast like this is that you will get what I call innocent bystander pixels, where we get some pixels like down here where the rock is receiving more contrast. It's starting to get really blocked up than I wish. All I really want to add this contrast to are the highlights in this image. I essentially want to add highlights to the brighter tones and leave those darker tones alone so they don't get so blocked up. So what I could do is, we'll start over here. I could grab a luminosity mask. Now this up here, this panel right here, this is called Lumenzia. There's a bunch of different luminosity mask creation tools. This is just one of them. There's Lumenzia, there's TK Actions, there's Raya Pro, there's the ADP panel. I prefer Lumenzia because it's simple. It has free tutorials. It's very easy to use. And even though he upgrades the functionality of it, he never changes the layout. So once you learn it once, it's easy to remember where everything is, even in future versions. So what's cool about this panel is rather than going over the channels tab and doing that stuff, I can just click on Lights 1 and it creates a Lights 1 luminosity mask, which essentially is just a black and white version of our photo. Or I could click on Lights 2, which is going to be a more contrasty version of a black and white version of our photo where it's more targeting just the highlights. Or I could grab, say, a dark one, which essentially is like a negative of the Lights 1, and so on. I could target just the darkest tones. You know, there's no limit to what you could select. But to keep things simple for now, I'm going to grab just a lights luminosity mask. And then from here, I can apply this as a layer mask to any adjustment layer. So let's say I wanted to add contrast, but keep that contrast only happening in the highlights. The way a layer mask works, white reveals, black conceals. If I was to apply this as a layer mask, it's going to allow whatever adjustment layer I apply this to affect the highlights more than the shadows. So I'll show you what I mean. With this selected, I'm going to just create another levels adjustment like we just did. So now we have a levels adjustment with this as our layer mask, which white reveals, black conceals. The darker tones are going to keep this adjustment out of the shadows, and the brighter tones are going to allow this adjustment to go into those tones. So as I add contrast to this, you're going to see that it affects the highlights far, far more than the shadows. So now I've added probably more contrast than we did before, but it's not blocking up our shadows nearly as quickly as if I was to deactivate this layer mask by holding down Shift and clicking on it. You can see that if we just apply this globally, not only is it doing too much, but it's really damaging our shadow information. But this using this luminosity mask as a layer mask allows this particular adjustment layer to only affect the tones that we wanted. So we can continue to do this. We could say, let's say I wanted to brighten only the brightest tones in this water, kind of using it like a dodging effect. Well, we could just go down here and create a brightness contrast adjustment layer. It would help if I could talk. And then we could grab a luminosity mask that's going to target just the brightest water. So the cool thing about luminosity masks is you can also alter them or modify them to do exactly what it is that you're wanting to do, because we're trying to target a specific tone, right? So if we're going to try to target just the water or just the brightest parts of the water, let's say rather than clicking on a lights 1, which is not very restrictive because the sky is still kind of gray, you know, the shadow areas of the water are still partially selected. Remember, gray is going to be allow that adjustment to kind of go into that area. White is going to allow it to come through more. So we could get a more restrictive luminosity mask, something more like this, and then apply this as a layer mask to that brightness contrast adjustment layer. So I'm just going to hit mask, which will apply that. It'll apply, this as a layer mask to the brightness contrast adjustment layer. And now when I brighten, we're only brightening the brightest tones. So we're basically adding contrast again only to those brightest highlights to kind of emphasize the dimension and depth. So we could add contrast to it. If, for example, we had a different type of scene where we have a lot of really bright highlights, we can kind of tame down the dynamic range of the scene by selecting those brightest highlights and then darkening things down, which would be kind of like a highlight recovery in Lightroom, only we would have the ability to then add contrast to it as well. So rather than decreasing the contrast by recovering highlights, we're actually increasing it as we're recovering and darkening down those brightest tones. So this method is using a luminosity mask as a mask. It's quite literally a luminosity mask. But more commonly than this method, I prefer to paint through a luminosity mask or a luminosity selection. So if we go over to this photo here, this is a really common like 2-shot exposure blend for me, where I have one image for my shadow information that I took very bright. I blew out some of my highlights, but I knew that I was going to want to, make this happen in 2 different images. So I took a second frame that was darker that I processed for the sky. And also the benefit to this is I can kind of treat them a little bit differently. This one that is for my shadow information, I've opened the blacks a lot, I've opened the shadows a lot, but I've also darkened it down. So even though it's very flat, it's still dark and natural. And then with our sky image, I've added contrast. I've added kind of a little sense of glow. That I just did that with a radial filter inside of Lightroom, where I added a little bit of warmth and a little bit of glow here, just to make it feel like the light's emanating over the rock face. Anyways, so the way that I'm going to exposure blend this is, first we need to start off with a layer mask. So I'm going to create a new layer mask, and I'm creating it on the darker version of the photo. And now I'm going to invert that layer mask, so we're completely hiding this entire layer. Remember, white reveals, black conceals. So I'm hitting Control or Command I to give me this black layer mask. I'm going to start off with a white paintbrush to start bringing in this sky. So B for paintbrush, 100% opacity brush. And I'm going to start up at the very top and just start manually painting this down in. So at this moment, we haven't done any kind of selection, any kind of luminosity mask, nothing like that. All we're really doing is trying to bring in this, as much of this sky as I can manually. That way we're bringing in this sky in its entirety. I want all of the darker clouds to be dark, rather than flat and weird if I was just to try to use a luminosity mask to bring that sky in. So what I've done here is I've just manually painted it down in, and I've kind of purposely created this bright halo around the outside edge of this rock. So when we go to create a luminosity mask, let's just create a lights 1. It's going to create that off of the current state of the photo. And you notice that the current state of the photo also reflects that halo. So that's actually going to help us in the way that we can really target the sky to help us finish bringing in this darker version of our sky. So what I'm trying to achieve here is I want to create a luminosity mask that's going to allow me to paint into the sky, but keep me out of the foreground rocks. Because the goal here is to finish bringing in the sky to finish off this exposure blend. So I can go up and create a lights 2, which you can see that the rock formation is almost completely black, which is good. That's exactly what we want, because black is going to function like a stencil to keep us out of that area. But what would be nice is for that sky to be a little bit brighter white, so it doesn't take a million passes with my paintbrush to get the paint through 100% in that sky. So what we need to do is we need to modify this luminosity mask. So in a perfect world, the sky will be white and the rocks will be black. We probably won't get there, but we can see how close we can get it. So Lumenzia gives us these 3 layers here. Now, these 3 layers are what's used to create this particular luminosity mask, and we can alter it. So if I click or double click on this levels adjustment, it brings up the properties just like any other levels adjustment. And now we can modify our luminosity mask. So by sliding these sliders around, I can add contrast, which is going to brighten the sky. And if I grab the left slider, it's going to crunch up the dark tones, which happens to be our rock formation that we want to be as close to black as possible. So something like this, if you think about how layer masks work, white reveals, black conceals. Selections are very similar in that white will allow paint to go through and black will deny the paint. So we're creating a nick-proof stencil where I can just blindly paint over this edge and the paint will go into my sky, but keep me out of the rocks for the most part. You know, there's some highlights in the rocks that are kind of selected. You just got to be careful not to go down in here. And these transition areas where there's like, you know, it transitions from the bright white to the black. This gray area here is going to take more than one pass, but we'll deal with that when we come to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a selection of this. Rather than using it as a layer mask, I'm going to select it. So it's going to be an active selection. So I'll hit this select button. That's going to load it as an active selection. I know that because it's green. But if I was to show this view, you can see that I've got marching ants just like any other selection. If I just grab the lasso tool or something, I can only paint within my selection. So I'm going to hide my marching ants, got a white paintbrush, and now we're going to start trying to finish off this sky. So I'm painting around our transition area here. And you'll see that like areas like over here where it was very bright, it only takes one pass for my paintbrush to bring that part of the sky in the rest of the way. But areas like the transition zones take more than one because anything that was gray was not 100% white, right? So it's going to take more than one pass to bring in or to reveal that layer to get it all the way to white. So what I'm doing here is just painting multiple times over and over and over around this transition zone. Careful not to go over my rock formation too much. If we zoom into this area here, this will give you a good view as to what we're doing here. I can paint here and nothing happens. But when I go over my sky, watch what happens. That is the beauty of layer masks, or luminosity masks, I mean. It's basically functioning like a stencil to where I almost can't screw it up as long as I do a good job of creating it and paying attention to some of the little things that can go wrong. Like, for example, these two images are not perfectly aligned. I was using a small tripod, so like things aren't perfectly aligned. I should have taken the time to fix that before I started, but you know, I can only do so much in a short presentation. So now I've got this little bit of halo here. I can see it, but a great way to visualize it is to hold down Alt and then to click on my layer mask. And it'll kind of show me where we're at with this exposure blend job. We can see areas that I've missed. We can see areas that I need to finish off. And we can see areas like over here where I've kind of went over the rocks a bit too much, where I was allowing paint to go in. So in this view, I can either keep going as I was, or I can fix some of the problems. So I'm going to, let's see here. Let's get this first. bring this in. And then I can kind of finish things off. So I just hit Control or Command D for deselect. So I no longer have that luminosity mask selected. And now I can just quickly go in here and finish off my paint job. I can also, I actually can't do it right now, but there's also a way that if I switched my brush over to overlay, I could switch to black and finish that off, but I'm not going to right now because the zoom stuff is covering my, oh, actually, no, it's not. I can change the blend mode of my brush to overlay, switch to black, and that allows me to kind of finish that off without going into our sky. So now when I go back to our normal view, we've brought in that sky with no weird halos before, after, before, after. And so like one of the things that people bring up a lot of times is that they feel like luminosity masks is almost more of a style. Like a lot of people start to associate luminosity masks with some kind of gaudy, overdone style. And that's because a lot of people that know how to use luminosity masks tend to be knowledgeable about post-processing, but also a little bit over the top with their post-processing. I'm totally guilty of it. Like a lot of my post-processing borders on overdone, and it's something that I'm always struggling with my photography. But what I would like to add to that is the fact that just because you have the power to do a lot doesn't mean that you have to, you know, go over the top with every edit you do. It's just another tool. It's just another technique that is incredibly powerful, incredibly useful for a whole bunch of different things. It's not a style as much as it is just another tool in the toolbox, because you can do as much or as little of all of this as you wanted. Like I could go in here and just decrease the opacity of this layer if I felt like that sky was over dark and not natural. You know, you can still create incredibly natural results, incredibly subtle edits, even though it's a very powerful tool. So yeah. So maybe it's a good time to stop and take any questions, Ragnar, if we have any that have come in.
Yes, we have a question from Alicia Erickson. Alicia, go ahead and ask your question.
So when you're doing all your selecting and you get your edges, I do a lot of like more portraiture than necessarily landscape. And sometimes when you select things like people, they end up looking like a cardboard cutout because it's like too harsh of a selection. Does that happen with luminosity masking, and how do you fix it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It is something that can happen. So you saw how I went in and I modified that luminosity mask. One of the things that you have to be really careful about is that you don't go overboard with that modification. The beauty of a luminosity mask is that it's not just white and black. It's not like just 100% selected and 100% not selected. There's all of those beautiful gray gradients in between. And you can really use that to your advantage to create like really natural transitions. You just have to be careful not to modify it to the point where you start getting that it's either selected or it's not. Another thing that you can do is there's no limit to how many times you can go back and grab a selection. So for example, let me show you, let me go back here. That's a really good question that is very relevant. So for example, if we had accidentally, I'm going to purposefully screw up this blend. So I'm going to create a harsh halo like so. Let's say that, why is that not working? Oh, it's because I'm on overlay. Let's say that we had some kind of harsh, I'm trying to make it more harsh. Let's say that we had some kind of weird edge like this. and we weren't able to get the results we wanted with a single luminosity mask. What we can do is we can go in as many times as we need and create a new luminosity mask that might target that better. So even though I've been pretend we've been trying to exposure blend this in, I can go in and try to find a luminosity mask that's going to target that halo that we have left. Sometimes you'll get halos around like tree limbs and tree leaves. That's a really tricky one to exposure blend because leaves are kind of translucent around the edges. So you always, like, if you did a perfect, like just right around the leaf selection, you're always going to get that weird part of the leaf that is actually brighter than the sky just outside the leaf, because you know the leaf is translucent around the thin parts. So what you would do is you'd go in and you'd create a selection like this of the, let's pretend this is a leaf, of the bright parts of the leaf. You'd select it, and then you would just go through and bring in that darker sky back. Make sure I'm painting in the right spot here. And I'm not. What do I got going on here? Oh, I think I just screwed up and painted painted paint on my, I did. Let's go back a few steps. I thought I was painting on my luminosity mask or my layer mask, and I was actually painting on my pixel layer. Let's go here and we'll just go boom, create a halo. Okay. Part of the struggle of doing these presentations is that there's this control bar up at the top that covers a large portion of my screen, so I can't see any of my brush adjustments. Just a little window there. And so now we can go in, we can create a luminosity mask that'll target that halo around whatever it happens to be. It could be the hair around somebody on a portrait or whatever. Target it, trying to keep the area dark that you want to keep your adjustment out of, and then start to try to fix it. So this could be a leaf that we're darkening the bright areas around the edge. It could be, you know, all kinds of things. But the cool thing is you can go in and create new luminosity masks to target whatever it is that you're trying to target. Maybe it's a dark halo. Let's say we went too far over this area. We could potentially go in and try to find a luminosity mask that will target just that and keep us out of the sky. Something more like this, maybe. Something like this. I could select that and then very carefully go in with a black paintbrush and try to fix what we had done there. So soften my brush like this. So you can always go and create as many luminosity masks as it takes to get the job done. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, there was another question from Pete. He wanted it's a great artistic question. It's like, how do you know when you feel like you've achieved what you want with the work?
That's a loaded one. So the best way to describe it for me is when I know an image is done when nothing bothers me anymore. So if I look at an image and something bothers me, it must not be done, because I could always go in and fix that. Sometimes it's just like the work that I've done on it that bothers me. Like sometimes it's just overdone and it bothers me. And so it's not only not done, it's overdone. So I have to like go back a few steps and start. But that's also the beautiful part of Photoshop is I can have a whole bunch of different layers there and just go back and start decreasing the opacity on some of the things that I have overdone. Or maybe I could, you know, just take that layer completely out and see if it looks better without that particular adjustment I did. So that's one of the beautiful parts of Photoshop is you can go back and sometimes one of my favorite things to do is I can stack up 20 layers of adjustments. And if I feel like it's all overdone, I'll just throw them all inside a folder and decrease the opacity of every single thing that I hit a little bit. That helps me when I've overdone stuff. So I see a question about the third party thing. Yes, that Lumenzia is a third party plugin. It's created by Greg Benz. I think it runs $35 or something like that. But it's such a time saver if you use Luminosity Masks at all, that it pays for itself quickly, because time is money. And creating some of these Luminosity Masks can be really, really slow. And it's worth it, in my opinion. Any other questions?
Anybody out there got a question? Okay, so I'll give everybody a little time. I have a question,
Sure.
Mr. Nick. So the other piece, I know you probably didn't want to cover it in this demo, but the other thing that I think is very powerful that you do is you're able to approach. It's a question and almost a statement. I apologize. You're almost able to approach your editing almost like a painter.
Yeah, absolutely.
In that, and maybe can you give it kind of describe that? This piece that's behind me, you do an example in your Luminosity Mask where you take this piece that's behind me and really create a not a painterly effect, but you use painting techniques to enhance the image.
So I always, because I'm a control freak, let me start this. I like to be in control over how the viewer's eye goes through my photo. To me, like a really successful composition is one where the eye knows what it's looking at. Like it just feels comfortable. It's got a path of some kind, and it's not just bouncing around from thing to thing to thing, not knowing what it should be looking at. For me, my favorite images are always, there's just like a comfortable flow to it. And one of the ways that I try to achieve that comfortable flow is being in full control over all the little things that the eye is gravitating towards, right? Eyes are always drawn to highlights, warmth, contrast. That's pretty much it. And strong shape, maybe color contrast or whatever. But so I really like to be in control over where the warmth is, where the highlights are, and where the contrast is. So I have another example I'll show you guys of where I'm very much trying to think like a painter and be in control over the light. So let's go back over into Lightroom here. I have over here somewhere. Here's another great example of how flat some scenes can be straight out of camera. Like this is in the Plus and it does not look like this. It's just the way raw files render it. So what I want here is I have this nice dappled light where this area is in shadow, this area is in highlight, and there's shadow, and then there's highlight. And I want to be in control over the way the viewer looks at this. It's going to benefit a lot from contrast. As I start to add it, you can kind of get a feel for what's going to happen there. But one of the things that I like to do is I like to do what's called dual processing an image. So I'm going to process this image twice from the same raw file and then blend it back in with itself. And I'm going to use Luminosity Masks to kind of do that. So to begin with, I'm just going to right click, select edit in, and then open as smart object in Photoshop. So the reason I want to open this up as a smart object is because it's going to allow me to re-access the raw file. So I can go back to this original raw file as many times as I need, and nothing is baked in ever. I can always just go back to the raw file and create another version of it. So what we're going to do here, the goal is to create some nice, deep, dark shadows in these dappled light areas, and then blend in some really nice, warm light where the light is hitting these hills. And the further apart that those shadows can be from those highlights, as far further apart on the histogram, the more contrasty it's going to be, the more interesting it's going to be, the more punchy it's going to be. So first thing I'm going to do is let's create a version of this that is going to work nicely for the shadows. So I'm just going to double click on this smart object, and that's going to bring up Adobe Camera Raw eventually. And the goal for these shadows is to have them nice and dark, but I don't want them so dark that I'm losing information. I just want them to be dark and kind of on the left side of the histogram. I want them to be fairly cool. I don't want them blue, but I don't want them as warm as the daylight is going to be on top of these hills. I want to have some nice color contrast. I don't want things to just be a wash of warm, because we will lose that sense of depth if it's all the same relative warmth. So I'm going to purposely cool down my color temperature a bit. Also, because of the way that the haze was working, this is what it was 400 millimeters. So I'm shooting through a whole lot of atmospheric haze. So because of that, the background is more blue than the foreground because it's just further away because of that haze. So I'm going to go up to a graduated filter. I'm going to reset it and then warm it up a little bit and then drag it down from the top. All that's going to do is just make the white balance in the back of the photo feel the same as it is in the front of the photo. And let's go back to the basic panel. I want to make sure that we're starting in a very dark, I want our shadows to be nice and dark. So I'm going to darken it down even more, and then I'm going to hit OK. So that is going to be the version for our shadow areas, for our shadow information. Now what we need to do is create a copy of this that's going to be for all those areas where the light is hitting and we're going to draw the eye to. This is going to be, basically, we're going to be painting with light. So I'm going to right click on this layer and then go up to New Smart Object via Copy. That's going to create a new version of this photo that is completely separate and completely unlinked to this first raw file that we can go in, double click, open up Adobe Camera Raw, and now we can process this one for all of the areas that are getting hit with light. So obviously we need to brighten it up. I want to add some contrast to it and definitely want to add some nice warmth to it. So I want it warm, contrasty, and bright. Maybe let's add a little bit of saturation. One of my favorite ways of doing that is to go to the calibration tab and increase the saturation of the blues. So if I swing this to the right, you can see, maybe you can anyway, you can see that we're getting a whole lot of saturation kick. Even though it's saturating the blue primary channel, there's a little bit of blue in every pixel. And so it's going to just help a little bit with that. So I'm going to hit OK. So now we have two versions of this photo. One for our daylight, where the light is hitting those hills, and then one for the shadow areas. So the way, kind of thinking like a painter, I'm literally going to Bob Ross our light in here. I'm going to put a little happy little dappled light on these hills. So I'm going to hold down Alt or Option and click on New Layer Mask, which is going to fill that layer mask with black. So I could have just created a new layer mask and inverted it, but it's much faster to just hold down Alt or Option and click on New Layer Mask. And now what we need to do is we need to go up here and find a layer mask or a luminosity selection that's going to keep us painting in the highlight areas, but for the most part, keep us out of those shadows. So we're going to have to modify this a bit. So those highlights are more selected and those shadows are less selected, something like this. And I don't want to go so far that we have really harsh transitions because it'll not look good, but I do want it to have a fair bit of contrast. So we're painting into those hills, but not painting into our shadows. So I'm going to select this. So it becomes an active selection. So I'm going to hit select. So because this is an active selection, what I was just looking at is going to function like a stencil. So it's going to allow the paint to go into the highlights, yet keep me out of the shadows. So here, I'm going to be able to just start doing some passes. I'm going to switch to white. And it's going to literally feel like we're painting with daylight. We're painting with a little bit of saturation, a little bit of warmth, a little bit of exposure. And now at this point, I'm in full control over where my highlights are going to live. I could choose to hit those back here, but I feel like it's a much better composition if all of our interesting light is a little closer to camera, and that just feels like it falls off into the background. So I'm just going to think like a painter. Where would Bob Ross put this light? Because I'm a control freak and I'm in full control over this photo. Nobody actually knows where the light was hitting, but I get to decide where it does. So I just go through, and because of how deep and dark those shadows were, it allows this photo to have a whole lot more impact because of the really strong difference between those deep shadows and these nice, bright, vibrant highlights. So something like this. Before, after. Before, after. Also, I feel like images like this, maybe I'll do just one little pass back there. Okay. Images like this also greatly benefit from the Orton effect. It's something I'm addicted to, and I literally put on every photo that I do. All the Orton effect is I create a copy, the current state of our photo on its own pixel layer. So it's just like what it looks like right now, only on a pixel layer. So that is Control Shift Alt E or Command Option Shift E on Mac. And when I do that, it gives us this layer right here. And now we're going to go up to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. We're going to blur it 30 some pixels. We're going to decrease the opacity of this down to 22%. Starts to give you a feel for what it's going to look like. Then I'm going to throw a luminosity mask on here. And the reason that I throw a luminosity mask on an Orton effect is because essentially we're adding some glow to the highlights. You know, if you have light reflecting off of something, the highlights glow, the shadows do not glow. So it makes no sense to have the shadows glowing as much as the highlights. So this effect is going to be more like the effect of the light bouncing off the reflective surfaces, which I know hills are not very reflective, but we're going to pretend. Okay, so just bear with me. And now we're going to go into Adobe Camera Raw, and we're going to brighten and add contrast to this blurred layer. So we're going to add contrast and brighten, maybe add a little bit of warmth to it, because remember, this is essentially the daylight effect that we're adding here. Something like this. Hit OK. So this effect is just kind of giving a kind of a softness to the hills. It kind of gives it the sense that it's glowing off of, you know, it just gives the highlights a certain glow. And yeah, so that's, we took that image from here to here in only 2 layers. And I would obviously continue to work this. I think it would benefit from more contrast in the highlights. So I'm going to grab a lights 1 luminosity mask and apply a levels adjustment to it. And then we're just going to add some contrast just to those highlights. That's going to really deepen the saturation in those highlights, but make them kick and punch a little bit more. Highlights should always punch back. Want to crop in on the top, get rid of that building at least a little bit. And I would be tempted to maybe open up the shadows in the back portions so there's a sense of depth. So the way the depth works, we're kind of getting off on a tangent here, but an image with depth often has nice dark shadows close to camera. But as you start looking through more atmosphere, those darkest tones should not get as dark. Blacks do not get all the way to black the further away from camera you get. So there's several different ways that you could do that. One of the easiest, honestly, is just to grab a curves layer, grab this left side and bring it up just a little, put a black layer mask on it, control Alt or Option, click it. And then with a white paintbrush, 50% opacity, just add a little bit of artificial haze to that background, so it has a sense of depth. Then full screen looks like that. Any questions, Ragnar?
Well, bravo. I think everybody's stunned with what you've done. Pete Meyer is totally impressed with your journey in just 8 years with this. David Fox had a question about photo RGB and 16-bit. Can you explain a little bit about that? And David, do you want to ask the question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so you're working in Pro RGB, Pro Photo RGB, and then
Yep.
16-bit. And can you explain why you do that?
Well, because I'm told it's better.
Okay.
That's pretty much same reason we all do it, because we were told to.
Earlier
You know,
days, we couldn't use Pro Photo RGB in a lot of the editing, but now they've improved it, so
right.
you can, and give you so much more capability. I just
Yeah.
wondered if there was any particular reason, your explanation you had.
Well, so obviously, you know, the wider your gamut is, the more it's going to hold up to all this contrast I'm adding. So there's two very important elements to especially when you're starting with a really, really flat scene and then you're grabbing that histogram and stretching it out. If first of all, shoot in Pro Photo in camera, you can usually only do Adobe RGB, but once you get it to your editing suite, make sure that you're using Pro Photo. And then also the way you expose it makes a massive difference. So if I was to expose this same scene in a way that looks good on the back of my camera, it's going to be severely underexposed, because I would end up putting all those midtones kind of low, you know, towards the left side of the histogram. And then when I stretch that out, what you're going to notice is all those fine gradations start to fall apart, because we recorded it at the left side of the histogram. The way histograms work, and I know a lot of you guys probably already know this, but maybe it's a refresher. The way histograms work, the way our digital cameras work, is on the left side of the histogram, it records exponentially less information than on the right side of the histogram. So if you have a really flat scene like this where everything's just kind of midtones, what you want to do is get that as bright as you possibly can to where it looks like junk on the back of your camera. Who cares how it looks on the back of your camera? But get it as bright as you can before clipping any highlights. That way, when you go to stretch it out by adding contrast to it, it's going to hold up, because it's got far more gradations than the version that looked great on the back of our camera. But as soon as we added contrast to it, it started to posterize and look terrible. So, you know, using a wide gamut for our
Color space.
there you go, color space. And then also the way we expose it. If it's a flat scene, push that thing all the way to the right if you can. A lot of people, and I'm very guilty of this, I shoot to where what's comfortable is make it look good on the back of your camera. But oftentimes that is not the way that you should be exposing it. You should be pushing it way over to the right, because with digital cameras, when we're shooting in the field, we're just in data collection mode. Who cares how it looks on the back of the camera? What matters is how it looks on the wall. So
On the histogram.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Push the highlights up to where they actually slightly clip because you can always pull back in RAW.
Yeah. But that's a dangerous game. But yeah, some of us are dangerous people. So
Well, yeah, and yes, also look, if it's a real high key image,
yeah,
that won't bite you so much. But otherwise, yeah, you want to push it right up to the edge.
agreed.
Great, thanks. That was a good explanation. I'm more familiar with it, but I didn't know if a lot of the other folks are.
And
the big
also, also when you're using luminosity masks like this, the gradations are really important. You know, the gradations are what make a luminosity mask so nice. So if you're starting off in a good place with a good luminosity mask that, you know, that has all those gradations, you're going to get a better result than if you're starting off with a bad one. So
Yeah, and if you start printing large images, that's where your gradations
yeah,
are so important because you won't get banding. And now you can print, your better printers would all print full 16-bit images.
yeah,
So that way you're going to not have that banding. So great, thanks.
yep.
Good. So Nick, we're kind of closing in on time. So does anybody else have any further questions or comments they'd like to make with Nick?
There will be a test. So, I mean, if you don't ask a question, it's really your fault if you fail the test.
Yeah, Amy. Oh, Amy, you need to unmute yourself, please. There you go. There you go, Amy.
Hi, Nick. I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us. It was just a pleasure to listen to you.
Well, it's just a pleasure to talk to you. So I guess we're even. No problem.
Yeah. So Nick, as you would do in your podcast, I got to do with you. So if our members want to go out and get more information about your work, your workshops, and that kind of thing, how can they reach out to you?
My website's the best place. So just nickpagephotography.com. There's links to the podcast and my YouTube channel there, but most people follow me on Instagram or on YouTube. I recommend YouTube. Who cares about Instagram? So you can find me. If you just Google search Nick Page, you'll find me eventually. But nickpagephotography.com is my website.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much.
Nick, I'd just like to say we thank you very much for joining us tonight and presenting a tremendously good program. And hopefully we're all encouraged, and we'll go out and dig deeper and follow you.
It's always challenging on this side of the camera because I want to give the fire hose approach, because I know you recorded it, so now you can go back and rewatch it a little bit. But
Right, yeah.
sometimes I get a little ahead of myself because I see a photo and I want to finish it, you know. So hopefully there was some nuggets mixed in with the gibberish.
Nick, when you recorded, that's actually called evidence.
Nice.
But very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yep.
And Nick, before you go, I want to say thank you so much. This has been an honor for me to have you as part of our presentation tonight. Like I said, I've been watching you for about 2.5 years. So actually be able to say something and have you respond to me just blows my mind. You know, to me, you're like bigger than life, and I've learned so much. My photography has grown so much because of the different tips and hints that you've given over about 2.5 years of watching your YouTube stuff. So thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for allowing me to watch one of my photography heroes do a presentation. It means a lot. And Rags has spoke very highly of you. I think he's the one who got me turned on to your YouTube channel. So you've got a little spokesperson here in Northern Michigan. We'd love to have you come visit sometime if you wanted to. I'm sure Ragnar could make something exciting happen for you.
Well, I appreciate that. I know it's always interesting, like when you get to sit down and actually meet or talk to somebody that you just see talking into a microphone or talking into a camera on YouTube. But I'm not bigger than life. I've been working on my figure, so I should be a little bit smaller than life. At least I'm working on it. No, I'm not.
Looking good, buddy. Looking good. Yeah.
Not helpful.
All right. Well, thank you guys for having me. It's